I think there was a single thing that Socrates came up with that is kind of like his core contribution to philosophy, and it's his method, right? There's a lot of controversy in the literature about whether Socrates even has a method, and if so, what is it, right? So I think he does have a method. But let me state first, like, the problem that the method is a solution to, okay? And I'm going to state it really anachronistically using William James's The Will to Believe, because I think that's actually the best statement of the problem that Socrates solved several thousand years earlier. So the problem is that if we want to know, if we want to have knowledge, or if we're in the project, in the business of coming to know, then it looks like we have to believe truths, right? And we have to avoid believing falsehoods. And a lot of people throughout history have thought those were somehow the same, very same project. What James argues, I think, really persuasively is not only they're not the same, they're actually incompatible. So here's an example. Suppose that you're doubtful about some proposition. I mean, you think it's probably true. Like, you think, does the external world exist or something, right? And you think like I'm almost sure it does, right? Should you believe that it exists or not? You might think, well, look, suppose your goal is to have some truths. Then you should believe that it exists, because you don't have any hope for having a truth unless you believe one way or the other, and you think it's more likely that it exists, so you should just go with that. But suppose that what you're committed to above all is avoiding falsehood. Well, then you should suspend judgment. It looks like insofar as you're committed to avoiding falsehood, like, you should kind of almost always suspend judgment, right? And so James, in The Will to Believe, engages with Clifford as the representative of that view. Always suspend judgment, right? Because, otherwise you might end up believing a lie, right? And that would be the worst thing ever. And James is like, that's not the worst thing ever. Telling somebody never to believe anything because they have some risk of believing a falsehood is like telling a general never to send his soldiers into battle because they might get a scratch. Right? He's like, you gotta take some risks in life. Okay. But what I think James is really good on is the idea that these two rules, have truths, believe truths, and avoid falsehoods, are in tension with one another. And insofar as you're like totally committed to the one, to having truths, like, well, you should just guess with respect to everything, like have some belief about everything, right? Because, that's how you can have a truth about that, right? But insofar as you care about like avoiding falsehoods at all costs, we'll just suspend judgment about everything, right? So they tell you to do opposite things. So they're not actually compatible. Just, to me, like, super revolutionary when I really faced up to that, because I'd always thought those were just kind of two ways of saying the same thing, right? What does James think you should do? Well, he doesn't agree with Clifford. Clifford thinks always prioritize the rule to avoid falsehoods, right? The thing that I think James thinks Clifford gets is you gotta prioritize one way or the other because they're not compatible, right? But what James thinks is, well, it's contextual. So sometimes prioritize the one rule, sometimes prioritize the other. It's going to depend. A lot of practical or action-based context, you're going to have to prioritize the rule to have some truths in order to have something to act on. So that's James's solution, is like balance it out and, some circumstances prioritize the one, some circumstances prioritize the other. That's not a good solution because you'll never have knowledge unless you're following both rules. That is, yeah, these rules might tell you to do opposite things, but you need to follow both of them in order to have knowledge. Because if you've acquired a truth, but you haven't followed the rule avoid falsehood, then you don't know that thing. Even if it's true, you don't know it, right? And so both of the rules, if they're followed individually, lead you to not having knowledge. In one case, because you won't have any beliefs. In the other case, because knowledge entails knowing that you know, and that entails avoiding error, and that entails following the negative rule as well as the positive one. Okay, so we have a predicament, right? In order to have knowledge, you have to follow both rules, but James shows you can't follow both rules. I think Socrates' method is a solution to that, which is, his thought is that you can follow both rules if you have two people and one of them is following one of the rules and the other is following the other rule, and they're doing it cooperatively, right? So what you have is an adversarial division of labor, kind of like what you have in a courtroom when, I'm the prosecution and you're the defense attorney, and my job is to make the case for the guilt of the person, and your job is to make the case for their innocence. Like, we both care about justice. We both want justice to be done, right? But justice has in it these two subordinate goals of convicting the guilty and acquitting the innocent, and they pull against one another. Like if you're totally committed to convicting every guilty person, like no matter what, right? Like you should just convict everyone, right? But then you're not going to acquit the innocent. If you're totally committed to acquitting every innocent person, if there's even the tiniest shred of doubt, well, then you're just not going to convict anyone. And so we give those jobs to 2 different people, and we say, you do this one and you do this one, and we're pursuing justice together, right? Because we're both doing a part of it. So I think that Socrates came up with that as a kind of solution to James's problem, but not in the area of criminal justice, but in the area of epistemology, essentially. So it's an adversarial division of epistemic labor. That's what I think the Socratic method is. So that's kind of like the core idea, I think, of the book, is that conception of the Socratic method in the early Socratic dialogues. So that's what the book will be about, I hope.